Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you the mix techniques that I use to get that more studio production sounding drum mix that you heard in the main video, recording your band in a rehearsal studio on a budget. Right. Now if you remember from that main video, I explained that the big problem we had was that the band chose this horrible live ambient room to record in. So all the mics picked up this big room sound, and that has the effect of making everything sound back in the distance in this big sea of room sound, right? But other things went wrong during the session that I didn't mention. We arrived at the studio, the kick drum mic was broken, so we ended up using a cheap vocal mic in the kick drum. So the kick drum track, it's a bit thin, it's got no thump or bass or body like you'd get from a kick drum mic. Other problems, the drummer showed up 45 minutes late by the time he unpacked and set up his kit. We were like an hour and a half into a 3-hour session, so I didn't get any time to do anything in terms of miking up the drums. You know, tuning the drums, but particularly working on dampening the drums and adjusting the mic positions, you know, recording, playing back, adjusting the mics. Those little things to try and get an even better drum recording, even in this terrible room that we had. There was no time for that. And other problems, the guitarist spent an hour and a half going through every single amp that the studio owned. You know, oh, let me try this one. No, I'll probably get a better sound from that one. No, let's try that one. And on it went, you know, until eventually he sort of abandoned the whole thing and ended up with this terrible guitar sound, you know. So all these musician type problems. But worst of all was this horrible live room sound. Okay, so as I said in that main video, we ended up with what you would call a worst case scenario recording. You're not going to get a worse recording than this if you do this technique of recording your band to 8 tracks in a rehearsal studio, right? Okay. Now, I've done a bit of mixing on the drum tracks. All I've used is some gates, some EQ and a little bit of compression. And by doing that, I've managed to eliminate quite a lot of room sound from the drums. Okay. So, you know, even with the thin kick, and, you know, I really don't like this ringing snare drum, this timbali-like tone, but now it sounds like a reasonable drum mix. You know, it's not great, it's not a production sound, but it's reasonable. And if that snare had only been a better snare, you know, with more of a crack to it and less of that timbali-like ring, you know, that would be, you know, a quite usable drum sound, even with this basic mix. To which we could then add re-recorded guitar, bass and vocals, and we'd end up with a reasonable recording. Right, not a great recording, not a proper studio production sounding recording, but a reasonable recording. Good enough to, you know, hand out to venues. This is what we sound like, give us a gig. Also very useful for bands to, you know, when you mic up things like the kick and everything and they get to hear themselves back for the first time, that's when bands find out they're not as tight as they think they are. So it helps you to work on getting the band tight. And it's good for trying out different arrangements in the studio and then playing them back at home and see which is the best one. But I wanted to go for a much more studio sounding, production sounding drum mix. And I'm going to show you now the complete procedure I did to get that. Right. Now we're going to use a combination of mixing the actual original drum tracks, and we're also going to use a technique called drum replacement. Right. Now obviously I'm going to show you all this in Logic, but all the big modern sequencers now have this drum replacement feature. Logic, Cubase, Pro Tools, Sonar, they all have it, right? Now just to explain, drum replacement, let's say you're going to do drum replacement on the kick. There's the kick track. So the software analyzes the kick track and it looks where the loud kick drum hits are on that track. And then from those kick drum hits, it generates a MIDI note that triggers a kick drum sample of your choice. So we're using, in the case of doing a drum replacement on the kick, we're using the kick to simply trigger a fresh kick drum sample that we can have more control over. Okay, but it's very, very authentic sounding and realistic because the triggering takes the exact timing and the velocity that your drummer used for each individual kick. And then when you've got a good quality sample playing back, being triggered by the kick track, you can then blend in some of the original kick track and you use this drum replacement technique, blend in the original drum mix with some of the replaced drums. You get more control, you get choice of drum sound for things like kick and snare if you replace them. blend in the original kit mix with it, and you get a very controlled, much higher quality studio production sounding drum mix. Now you're probably saying, well, hang on a minute, you're going to be using samples. It's cheating. Well, what do you think happens in modern production? Why do you think the bands that you listen to all sound so good and so tight? All right? These techniques are used all the time. Drum replacement is used to get better drum sounds. The audio is re-timed to make the band sound super tight. You've got things like auto-tune. Yeah, these are all just modern production techniques that are used all the time, right? And that's all we're doing. We're just using some modern production and mix techniques. So, again, I'm doing this in Logic. For you to do the same thing, you just need to find out how to do the drum replacement in the sequence that you use, and then just follow the general principles that I'm going to show here, okay? So, let's crack on with it and get these drums mixed. Okay, now I'm using Logic here. You might not be, so I'm not going to go into huge detail about how the drum replacement feature works in Logic. I've already done a tutorial on it, and you'll find it in the Logic Tips playlist on our channel. Okay, but I'm going to start by doing a drum replacement on the kick. Right. So we select the kick track, and in Logic we go track, replace or double the drum track. Boom. Now when you do that in Logic, this box appears, the dialog box for your settings, and the track that you're doubling or replacing is auto zoomed, and below it an instrument track is created with a sampler on it. And then if I choose kick from the dialog box here, a kick sample is loaded onto the sampler on this instrument track, and there you can see the MIDI notes taken from the hits on the kick track, the loud peaks, right? Let's go to the beginning there. Okay, so now in Logic we adjust the threshold. If the threshold goes lower and lower and lower, then quieter and quieter hits on the track that's being analysed get turned into MIDI notes. So you've got to set this so that you get a MIDI note for every kick, but you don't get a MIDI note for things like snare hits that are bleeding through onto the kick drum track. Now I'm using Logic here, but every sequencer has its own version of this threshold. Right? Some sequencers will call it threshold, some will call it sensitivity or whatever. But you adjust the threshold of sensitivity until you're getting just notes for kicks. Now if you look at the kick track here, there's a normal kick, loud, two more, loud, there's another one. But look at that bump there. I'll put the play there. There's a little bump there. Now that could be a low level kick, a little gentle kick. But if we look below on the snare track here, it's actually a snare that's bleeding through onto the kick track. So I've got the threshold set too low, and this snare bleed on the kick track is being detected as a kick note. So I'll raise the threshold, and now it's gone. Okay. Now I'm just going to, here at the beginning, there's a double kick followed by a snare. I know it's a double kick followed by a snare, so there's one extra kick there. So I'll raise the threshold again until that goes away. Okay, now we've got a MIDI note for each genuine kick. Done. And in Logic, if you want to do a replacement, you choose replacement and it mutes the original track. Doubling leaves the original track open. Right? So we set our sensitivity threshold, we've got a MIDI note for each kick. Okay. And we end up with this MIDI region with trigger notes taken from the kicks. Right? Let's do the snare next. So choose the snare track, same thing, track menu, replace or double drum track, and the same thing happens. The track that we're analysing is auto zoomed, and I choose snare from the box here, and below the auto zoomed track that's being analysed, an instrument track is created with a sampler on it, and because I chose snare, it's loaded a snare sample, and we do the same thing with the threshold. Adjust the threshold until we get a MIDI note for each snare. Now this is a bit trickier with the snare because drummers obviously they play loud snares, and you can see the loud snares if we zoom in. Right, like snare, 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 snare fill, snare, snare, snare. right? But also drummers do these little offbeat licks, you know, boom, ba, a little offbeat ones that are quieter. So we need the threshold low enough that we're catching some of those little offbeat licks. And inevitably sometimes we are going to accidentally get a kick instead. Like look, there's a little bump there on the snare track. Now is that an offbeat snare lick or a kick? Well, look above, put the player where that bump is there. Look above, there's no kick, so that really is a snare. We've got a note for it. Alright? But what about that one there, that little bump there? Let's move the player to where it is. That little bump there. Is that a little offbeat snare lick or a kick? Look up at the kick track. No, there's no kick there, so again that's a little offbeat snare. We've got a note for it. Right, so there we go. We've set the sensitivity or threshold. Got a note for the snares, and including the little lower level, more gentle offbeat snares. I'm doubling, not replacing. Okay. Right. And now we've got a MIDI track for the trigger notes taken from the snare track, and this is on an instrument track with a snare sample loaded. Now the next thing is the toms, and I'm going to do a tom replacement because in the studio we didn't mic the toms. We just had a mic on the kick, snare and hats, and we used a pair of overheads to capture the cymbals and the toms. But because of the enormous amount of room sound, if we listen to the overhead track, it's got huge amounts of room sound on it, right? But these were the only mics picking up the toms. I mean, the snare mic will pick up some of the tom as well, but these are the mics that were picking up the toms and the cymbals. But to get rid of the room sound, what I've done on this overhead track is I've used an EQ with a high pass cutting everything from 1K out. Below 1K is taken out. Right, if we just adjust that cutoff point for the high pass, you'll hear as I lower the high pass down, so we start to hear more and more of the mid and the bass end, you start to hear more of the room sound, right? Right, so I've raised that up to about 1K, so we're getting rid of all the mids and the bottom end, which is where most of the room sound is on those mics, and I'm doing a high shelf boost here to even add more emphasis to the cymbal frequencies, right? So because I've got this extreme EQ cutting all the mids and bottom end out of the overheads, the toms picked up by the overheads, you'll hear them as a little tick 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 thin, you know, because with this EQ you still hear the snares being picked up and the toms, but you just hear the high end frequencies of them. Okay, so when there's a tom fill, we'll hear it as tick tick tick, these little high end frequency notes, frequencies coming off the toms, but there'll be no body to the toms because we've EQ'd out all the body from the overheads. So I'm going to do a drum replacement for the toms, right? So I take the overhead track, same thing, track, replace or double drum track, boom. The overhead track gets auto-zoomed, below it an instrument track is created. I set the dialog box to tom, right? Now in this case we're going to set the sensitivity or threshold just kind of enough that we're getting a MIDI note for every loud hit, because this overhead track contains snares, kicks and toms, right? So I've just set the sensitivity or threshold so I'm getting a MIDI note for every loud hit, right? And then afterwards we'll figure out which are the toms and separate them out, all right? Done. We're doubling. Okay. All right. So that's done. Now, now the thing that we have to do is go through this overhead trigger track with the notes taken from the overheads and figure out where are the notes that are toms, because all these notes are toms, snares and kick drums. So you go through the song looking for fills where there are toms. All right, so let's listen to this fill here. I'll use the overheads soloed and take the EQ off. So right, here we go. Right, there's a tom fill. So let's put a little cycle range roughly around where it is. Okay. Okay, now let's turn that cycle range off for a minute. That kick there on the kick track, right? that kick drum there on the kick track, that's the kick for the beginning of the next bar after the fill. Okay, right. So I'm going to put a cycle range around where the tom fill is, and that cycle range needs to end just before that kick, because that's where the drummer comes out of the fill on that kick back into the next bar. Right, now look at the snare and the kick track. Here is where the drummer begins the fill, and he does it on the snare to begin with. Da 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 la la la. He's playing 16th snare lick, and he's holding down eighths on the kick underneath the whole fill. Kick, 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 and then here's the snare. Diddle 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 diddle. And then on that kick drum there, he stops playing the snare, so he obviously transfers to the toms on that kick. So that's where the beginning of my cycle range needs to be. And now this cycle range is around the toms. Like that, okay? Alright. So with the cycle range around the tom fill, I select the region with the trigger notes taken from the overheads, which is toms and snares, and then I'm going to go edit, split at locators. Boom. Some of the notes are overlapping the start and end point of the locator, so I do split. Those notes will be split and retained. Boom. There we go. There's our tom notes for that fill. Just move these region ends out of the way to isolate that. That's got some tom notes in it, right? So now let's find the next tom fill. Is it here? No. Is it here? Let's just solo those overheads. Is it there? No. What about there? No. Here? Well, I think there's one tom being hit there or something. Diddle-diddle-doom. Yeah, there is. There's one tom there. Just there. Oh, whoa! Just there. So that note there is a tom. So I'm not going to bother doing the cycle range thing. I'll just chop this little section out. I know the last note there is a tom. Alright. So let's just go into that and take out the other two notes, leaving us that one tom note. Right? Okay. Alright, let's find any other tom fills. Is that a tom fill? Nope. What about here? Nope. What about here? No. What about here? Yeah, there's a tom fill. Let's zoom in on it. It's roughly around here. Okay, where does the fill end? Well, that big kick there is probably where the drummer begins the next bar. That kick right there is the beginning of the next bar after the fill here. Okay, that's correct. So that's where the fill ends there. So our cycle range wants to end just here where that kick begins. Right? It's the same as his previous fill. There's the snare fill at the beginning of the fill. He's holding down eighth kicks. So on that kick drum there, he ends the snare fill here and he transfers to the tom. So that's the beginning of my cycle range. Okay, and now I've got a cycle range round the tom fill. Okay, so we do the same thing. Select this region with the trigger notes, edit, split at locators, and split any notes overlapping. Boom, those are tom notes. Just drag these other region ends out of the way to isolate that. And now I know, because I know this track, I've heard it a lot, that at the very end there's a single tom there, just there in this final fill, right at the end. Da 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 dong, yeah, yeah, da 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 dong da da. Right, that is a tom. That little bump there. So that note there on the trigger track, that is a tom. So I'll just manually chop it and isolate it with the scissors. That's it. That's all the tom's notes isolated. So now we don't need this part. You know, this region's got nothing we need. That, get rid of. That bit, get rid of. That bit, get rid of. That bit, get rid of. And we're left with this little region with tom notes. That little region with tom notes. Tom notes. And that single tom note. Okay. So now we've got all our trigger notes. Okay. On this track here, we've got all the tom trigger notes in those 4 little regions. There's our kick notes, there's our snare notes. And let's just quickly check the kick notes on the kick track. Yep, they're all on C1, the correct MIDI note number for kicks. And the snare trigger track, yep, they're on D1, the correct note for snares. And the toms, well, they're on something like G or A1. But the main thing is they're not on C1, they're not on D1. We'll see them clearly separately from the C1 kicks and the D1 snares. So now we need to merge the snare, the kick, and the tom trigger regions. We need to merge them all together into the same region. So I highlight them all, and then using the glue tool, I click on the region on the kick trigger track, and it will merge the tom note regions and the snare note region into this kick region. Boom. Now all the notes are together in this region. On this instrument track, which was created when we did the analysis of the kick, and it's got a kick sample on it only. That's it. So we no longer need this track here, which was the trigger track for the overhead analysis, and we no longer need that track, which was the trigger track from the snare analysis. All our MIDI notes for our triggers are now on this track, which currently has a sampler with a single kick sample on it because it was the original kick trigger track. And now on this you put your easy drummer or whatever acoustic drum instrument to be triggered by these notes. All right? And I'm going to use Logic's built-in drum kit designer. It's similar to something like Easy Drummer. You can customize kits, choose the snares, the snare you want, the kick you want, the tom set you want, the cymbals you want, the ride you want, the hats you want. You can tune the drums, you can dampen them, adjust their gain, you can assign whether or not they've got room, they're being fed to the room mics, to the overhead mics, etc. Right, it's quite comprehensive. So I'm going to load a drum kit designer kit onto this track with the trigger notes. And by the way, there's a full drum kit designer tutorial on our channel. Full, right? It's incredibly powerful. So I'm going to choose drum kit, a producer kit, and I'm going to go with this one called Heavy. Boom. And I'll load the heavy kit onto the trigger track with all the trigger notes. Let's have a listen. Okay, now I've chosen this drum kit called Heavy, which is designed for doing like heavy rock, metal, stuff like that. When you're choosing your drum replacement drum samples, if you're doing a total replacement where you're not going to use any of the original snare, and you know, like say if you've replaced the snare, you're not going to blend in some of the original snare with the sample of the snare. You're just going to do a straight replacement. Well, in that case, you can choose any snare drum you want. But in this case, I'm going to blend in some original snare. So the original snare, it's got all this timbali-like ringing. It hasn't got much thwack or crack to it. It hasn't got much, nice tight snare wire bam to it, right? That's what's missing. So I've chosen the heavy kit because it gives me that. Those qualities in the snare, in the heavy kit, are what's missing from my real snare. So I've chosen a snare that gives me the qualities I'm lacking in my real snare, and then I'll blend in a bit of the real snare with it. Okay? So we're ready to mix in the rest of the drums, right? But before I do that, let's turn all the real drum tracks all down. Before I do that, I'm going to go into the mixer, and on the sample kit, open it up. It has individual output channels for all the drums. I'm going to take the room mic channel down because I don't want room sound, or very little. And the leak channel I'm turning down. This leak channel in these Logic producer kits is like a close mic ambient spillage sound channel. I'm going for quite a dry, isolated sound. Then on the final output here, I'll just give it a little bit more compression ratio and just ramp the makeup gain up a bit. Okay, so I've got, you know, fairly dry, isolated drum sound. Okay, with very little room sound. Okay, alrighty, and now I'll blend in the real drums. I'll start with the hi-hats. The hi-hats have got this EQ on, cutting all the bottom end out, so the hats are just, you know, we've just got the high-end frequencies where the hi-hats are. Okay, a little bit of high-end content obviously being spilling across from the snare and what have you. So I'll blend in some hats. Let's find a section where the hats are being played. Okay. And next the overheads. Now, same thing with the overheads. I'm using an EQ to cut all the bottom end out. Okay, so I'll blend some of that in. Okay, and then the snare. Now the snare, I've got some noise gate on it, some EQ and compression. I've used this EQ curve, cutting out the bottom end below 50 Hz, bit of a bass bump, scooping out the mid around 500 Hz where the most horrible, boxy, timbali-like ringing tone is. A little bit of boost, narrow boost there at around 5K. We're all, you know, to try and get more high-end crack out of the snare, the real cutting edge of the snare, right? We'll blend a little bit of that in, just enough so we start to hear some of the snare ring. Yeah, about that much. And then if you want, you can blend in some kick. Now the kick, I've gated it, I've compressed it. I'll actually take the gate out now. Compressed it, EQ'd it. It's a classic kick drum EQ. A classic kick drum EQ is a bump at the bass end, scooped out mid, and another bump up at around 5K where the click of the kick is. But I've also rolled off all the top end and rolled the bottom end off below 40 Hz, just get rid of any unnecessary rumble, right? Now I can optionally blend some of this kick in. But the kick track has a lot of bass guitar on. So, you know, this is optional, right? And that's it. That's how I did it. All right. There's one last thing to do, or a couple of last things to do. The tom notes. All right. There's one of the tom fills. There's the 3 tom notes. Give them a bit more velocity. Right. When Logic or your software analyzes the toms, it'll give you the position of them based exactly on where the drummer played the toms, and it'll give you the velocity. But Logic won't, or whatever sequencer you're using, it doesn't know which tom is being played, right? So that's up to you to manually move the notes to the tom you want. All the toms are on the mid tom. All the tom notes are on the mid tom trigger note, right? So, for example, this fill, these could be played on the high tom. Yeah, I like them like that. Let's go to the next fill, which is that single little tom just there. A little bit more velocity. Yeah, I'll leave that on the mid tom. The next fill is down here. This is the bigger fill. Just shorten those notes so they're not overlapping. Give them a little bit more velocity. Let's hear that. Now again, which notes are these toms on? Let's have a listen to the overheads without the EQ. Perhaps we can find that out. Let's put that cycle range back over there. Right, so it's 1, 2, 3 on the high tom. So these 3 toms are going to go up to the high tom. Just put this snap to bar so they don't move left or right when I move them. Up to the high tom. That is an extra note. That's where he hit with a stick. Accidentally, instead of hitting the actual drum skin, he hit the rim with the stick. So I'll leave it as a mid-tom, and these can either be low toms or stay on the mid-tom. Right, let's hear it. Let's put the EQ back on the overheads. Okay, let's hear that now, the full fill. You know, I can make these last two the floor tom. But you know what, I'm going to leave them on the mid tom. Okay, just give them all just a little bit more velocity. There you go. And then finally there's that one last tom note right at the end. There it is. A little bit more velocity. That's it. That's the last thing to do. Get the toms on the right notes for the right tom to trigger the correct tom. Now there's one last thing when we're looking at the very beginning of the MIDI region with the trigger notes, right? Right at the very beginning. Whoop, before the beat comes in properly. And there are these 4 snare notes. Now these obviously came from the analysis of the snare track, but the track doesn't begin till here, after the guitar intro there. So these 4 notes, which were detected on the snare track, they're obviously the drummer going click, 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 counting in with his sticks. So raise the velocity. And in this particular, in these producer patch kits in Logic, you get a drum stick click sound. Maybe your sample drum player has that as well. So we're just going to move these up. And now we've got raised their velocity. Got a nice clean sample sticks counting, which exactly correlates with the timing of the real click counting picked up on the snare track and the overheads. Now there's a light snare. This is the other thing you can do. You can go through your trigger track with all the trigger notes, and you know, if the drummer accidentally didn't hit a drum with the right velocity, you can correct that. Pardon me. And there he did it. Look, just where the playhead is. Right. Look, these are normal snares. The normal loudness he hits them, but this one he's mishit the snare. Look, it's not very loud there. So that trigger note isn't loud enough. So let's bring its velocity up. There we go, nice and loud now, the same as the others. Okay, now we've got the right velocity on that bum note the drummer played. Okay, that's it. On this trigger, with the trigger notes, you can take any out that are incorrect, adjust the timing slightly forward or backwards for any that are, you know, audibly slightly early or late, causing you to kind of wince, you know. Change the velocity, anything you like. And there it is. That's how I did it. Right. Blending in some of the overheads with all the mids and bottom cut out, blending in the hats with the mids and bottom cut out, little bit of extra snare, optional kick added in, and now you would just mix it. And that, considering we started with a worst possible quality, worst case scenario drum recording, that is a very tidy drum sound. And we can now overdub our fresh guitar, bass, vocals, etc. over that and turn out a really quite produced sounding, studio sounding demo. Okay, I hope that's useful.